So our question was, how did the values of superheroes change during the Cold War?
We're going to be discussing this question by talking about World War Jingoism, the Korean War, atomic energy, the Vietnam War, the space race, and Cold War propaganda.
World War Jingoism. Jingoism is a very aggressive form of patriotism where the country imposes a warlike foreign policy, so they don't like other countries or their values. This can be seen during World War II through the propaganda that was used by American government. Propaganda is biased information that is published to promote a certain political view. In this case, in superhero comics, it promotes a pro-American political view, which is biased against Nazi and Japanese values. We can see that through the covers and content of the comics. We can see that through the covers in Superman and Captain America through the American flag, which presents patriotism. We can see that through portrayal of political enemies that America used to have, like Hitler. In this segment in Wonder Woman's first issue, he is portrayed as some kind of deranged, very crazy individual who is chewing on a rug. And then we can see that in Captain America's cover, he is punching Hitler, and Superman is holding him up by his collar, making him seem weak.
Now let us continue with the Korean War. The Korean War was a conflict in the early 1950s between North Korea, who was communist, and South Korea, who was anti-communist, capitalist. The United States, of course, fought alongside South Korea. While there were less superhero comics during this period, they were still regularly sold. And much like the patriotism and jingoism displayed in World War II comics, superhero comics during this period were similarly used as propaganda, this time against communist enemies in the Korean War. Japanese villains were now Korean and Chinese, with provocative names like the Mad Mongol Monster and Vampira, the Korean Queen of Terror. Superheroes would regularly battle the communist way and embrace capitalism and American values. By the end of the Korean War, superheroes would continue to have anti-communist values and would still be used as anti-communist propaganda.
Just
So at the beginning of the atomic age, there was a view of atomic energy as this magic bullet that was going to cure all of the world's issues. And this can be really well seen in this first comic, Boy Commandos. So in it, you have this atomic car that they're driving, but it's not just a car, it is also a submarine and also a plane. And this is showing that the possibilities with atomic energy are limitless. And this idea is seen again in 1954 in the second comic. So in this, we see a similar idea where they're driving this atomic submarine, but again, it's not just a submarine, it's also a plane and a spaceship. Now, as you progress through time, you see a more negative portrayal of atomic energy, and this is also seen in this second issue, where they're showing a destructive aspect of atomic energy in the fact that there is a hydrogen bomb.
Miss Shield,
Yes.
can you please send Shiv Anandu to the attendance office? Thanks.
Can you wait? He's presenting. Is it needed right now?
No,
Continue?
Mm-hmm.
Alright, so again, there's a destructive aspect being shown in the fact that there's a hydrogen bomb coming to Earth from the moon. Now, as we progress forward, this comic is Amazing Fantasy number 15 from 1962. And in it, we see Spider-Man and the very famous line, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." So according to Shepard, a comic book expert from the University of South Carolina, Spider-Man can be seen as a stand-in for atomic energy. And this is because he gains his powers from being bitten by a radioactive spider, after all. So it's saying to the American audience that, yes, this American discovery is great and all, and we have all of this potential, but we have to be really careful with it because of its destructive capability, and this really shows the negative aspect of it.
Just as Shiv stated, the comic books were continued to be used as propaganda during wars. So in the beginning of the Vietnam War, especially pictured here with the first comic books of Iron Man, where he is in Vietnam, they portrayed North Vietnamese communists as enemies of America and showed much of pro-American ideology, especially here where he calls the North Vietnamese red terrorists. But as America begins to bomb Vietnam, there's widespread protest in the American people, and comics begin to shift away from the very expressive pro-American ideology, as pictured here in Spider-Man, where Flash Thompson's story is less about the conflict in Vietnam and more about Flash Thompson's personal story and his journey as a veteran.
So the space race sort of acts as a counter-argument to our thesis, where our thesis says how the amount of propaganda decreases over time. The space race acted as a counter-argument and another perspective because it had a lot of propaganda. So let's start with some background information. So the space race lasted from 1957 all the way until 1975, around the peak of the Cold War. So the space race was a battle of state supremacy between the Soviet Union and the United States through the medium of sending rocket ships and satellites and people to space. For example, here's Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. So in comic number 1, The Fantastic Four versus the Skrulls from Outer Space, published in 1962, you see the Fantastic Four, which is a very American group of superheroes, versus the Skrulls from Outer Space, which resemble the Soviets because of their rocket missions and their nuclear codes. And comic number 2, The Green Lantern versus the Menace of the Runaway Missile. We see Green Lantern here, who also portrays American patriotism, versus a runaway missile straight from space sent by a evil scientist acting under a Soviet-like state.
So, as Rosario mentioned in the beginning, propaganda is used to either promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Comic books became an integral part of war propaganda and were used to sell respective ideologies in order to sway American audiences against communists. So, Is This Tomorrow? America Under Communism showed how communists had infiltrated about nearly every aspect of America and discussed the issue of invasion and general undermining of society. By using the comic book as a form of propaganda, one is able to depict the enemy through derogatory illustration allusions more powerfully than with words. So, on the other hand, superhero characters such as Superman and Captain America were aiming to instill patriotism and build support during times of national crisis. A notable feature of this was them wearing red, blue, and white costumes. Over the following 70 years, war comics largely depended on the nation's involvement in wars, which also influenced the comics villains.
So in conclusion, as comics progressed through the Cold War, the very aggressive attitude of the comics was toned down. So this is especially seen in the atomic-related comics as well as in the Vietnam War. Now, looking at this first comic, we can see it's very us versus them, where it's America versus the Nazis. Now, as we go through, we still see these very American values, because again, these are American comics after all. But it's toned down, and it's just generally good guys versus bad guys, rather than a very United States versus an enemy. And then we have our sources, and that's it. Thank you very much.